The Force binds all things, but this galaxy had no force. What it had was something stranger, something that hummed through plasma conduits and spoke in the measured tones of a bald captain who had, in his considerable career, encountered gods, paradoxes, and the end of humanity itself. Captain Jean-Luc Picard believed he had seen everything the universe could produce. He had not seen this. The anomaly appeared without warning on the bridge of the USS Enterprise-D at 0347 hours, stardate 44291. 6. No transporter signature. No spatial rift. No subspace distortion. One moment the air above the command center was empty, filled only with the soft amber glow of status displays and the quiet hum of the ship traveling at warp 6 through the Viridian corridor. The next moment, something hit the ceiling. Not something. Someone. He stuck to it. Lieutenant Worf was on his feet in under a second, disruptor, no, phaser, drawn and leveled, his deep voice filling the bridge like a war drum. Intruder alert. All hands. Whoa, 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 the figure on the ceiling twisted, and the voice that came out was young. Startlingly young. And confused in a way that was entirely too genuine to be threatening. Okay. Okay. This is not the Daily Bugle rooftop. This is very much not the Daily Bugle rooftop. Peter Parker hung upside down from the ceiling of the Enterprise-D bridge, his red and blue suit slightly singed at the left shoulder from whatever transit had deposited him here, his brown eyes wide behind the white lenses of his mask, scanning the room with the rapid, instinctive assessment of someone who had been dropped into impossible situations enough times to have developed a personal checklist for them. Checklist item 1, am I alive? Yes. Checklist item 2, is anyone shooting at me? Not yet, but the large angry alien with the forehead ridges looks very committed to changing that. Checklist item 3, where in the name of Tony Stark's ghost am I? Fascinating, said a voice from the science station, utterly calm. The android officer, gold-skinned, amber-eyed, head tilted at precisely 7.3 degrees, studied the ceiling-mounted stranger with the focused attention of a scientist observing a previously undocumented phenomenon. The individual appears to be adhering to the ceiling through direct contact adhesion. No magnetic assist. No technological anchoring device. The coefficient of friction required for data. Picard's voice was quiet. It cut through everything anyway. He rose from his command chair slowly, hands clasped behind his back, and looked up at Peter Parker with the measured expression of a man who had once talked down an omnipotent being through sheer intellectual stubbornness. I am Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the USS Enterprise. You are aboard a Federation starship. I would appreciate it if you would come down from my ceiling. A beat of silence. Your ceiling is really clean, Peter said. Like, spotless. Who cleans your ceiling? Mr. Worf. I do not clean the ceiling, Worf said, deeply offended. Peter dropped. He didn't fall, he flipped, a single fluid rotation that brought him landing in a three-point crouch directly in the center of the bridge, between the command chair and the helm, close enough to the con officer that Lieutenant Ro-Laren leaned back instinctively in her seat. He straightened slowly, hands raised, palms out, projecting the universal body language of I am not immediately trying to hurt anyone, which Picard noted was at least a reasonable opening position. The spider sense wasn't screaming. That was important. In Peter's experience, when he landed in genuinely dangerous situations, the sense hit him like a fire alarm behind his eyes, sharp, urgent, directional. Right now it was murmuring. Alert, watchful, cataloging threat vectors, flagging the big Klingon security chief as priority 1 and the android as unknown unclassifiable. But not screaming. These people were tense, not predatory. Whoever they were, their first instinct wasn't to kill him. That was already better than half his Tuesday afternoons in New York. He pulled the mask up to his nose, because he needed to think, and he always thought better when he could actually breathe properly and also make facial expressions. The face beneath was young, early 20s, dark-haired, with the kind of tired eyes that belonged to someone who had been running on insufficient sleep and excessive guilt for most of his adult life. "Okay," Peter said. "Okay. I'm going to need someone to explain, slowly, what just happened, because 30 seconds ago I was webbing up the vulture, not a real vulture, a guy named Toombs, it's a whole thing, and then there was this light, and this voice that said something about, what a curious little arachnid, and then I was on your ceiling." He paused. The voice. Did it come from anyone here, or? It did not, Picard said. Great. Great, great, great. So something brought me here. Something with a personality. Something that called me an arachnid. Peter's jaw tightened slightly beneath the half-raised mask. I have a bad feeling about this. Picard studied him for a long 3 seconds. Then he made a decision, the kind of decision that defined why he sat in that particular chair. "Counselor," he said quietly, without turning. "Impressions?" Deanna Troi, ship's counselor, half-betazoid empath, had been watching from her seat beside the command chair since the moment Peter appeared. She spoke carefully. "He's frightened. Significantly. But he's suppressing it with extraordinary discipline for someone his apparent age. He's not hostile. She paused, something flickering across her face that wasn't quite confusion, he's concerned about us. He arrived in a completely alien environment 30 seconds ago and he's already worried about whether we're safe." Peter blinked. "How did you?" "She's an empath," Data offered helpfully. "She senses the emotional states of those around her. It is one of her most remarkable." "Data," Picard said. "Yes, Captain. Perhaps now is not the moment." "Of course, Captain. My apologies." Picard clasped his hands behind his back and faced Peter Parker fully, and in that moment the captain of the Enterprise brought the full weight of his diplomatic experience, his scholar's mind, and his fundamental decency to bear on a frightened young man from another universe entirely. "You are clearly not from this galaxy," Picard said. "You are clearly not a threat, at least not an intentional one. And whatever brought you here did so deliberately." A pause. "Welcome aboard the Enterprise, Mr. Parker," Peter said. "Peter Parker. He almost said friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, stopped himself, recalibrated. "I'm from New York. Earth. But I'm guessing not your Earth." "No," Picard agreed. "Not our Earth." He turned toward his security chief. "Mr. Worf. Stand down, but maintain yellow alert." Then to his helmsman, "Drop us out of warp. Bring us to full stop." And finally, to the young man standing in the center of his bridge with raised hands and exhausted eyes, "I believe, Mr. Parker, that we have a great deal to discuss. And I suspect neither of us will particularly enjoy the explanation. If you want to see more crossover stories like this one, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd love to see land in the Star Trek universe in the comments below. May the Force be with you. The medical bay of the USS Enterprise-D smelled like recycled air and something faintly antiseptic that reminded Peter of the school nurse's office, except significantly more advanced and staffed by a doctor who had apparently decided that professional skepticism was a personality trait worth cultivating to its absolute limit. "I'm not sick," Peter said, for the third time. "You're an unknown biological entity from an uncharted dimensional origin point who adhered to my ceiling and flipped through my bridge like a circus performer," Dr. Beverly Crusher said, without looking up from her medical tricorder. "You'll forgive me if I conduct a thorough examination regardless of your self-assessment." Peter sat on the bio bed with his mask fully removed now, his suit jacket, the red and blue looked even more aggressively colorful under sickbay's clean white lighting. Creased and slightly scorched at the shoulder where Q's transit had kissed the fabric with whatever energy had dragged him across dimensional barriers. The biobed hummed beneath him, soft and persistent, feeding data to Crusher's display with each passing second. The readings were making her frown deepen. Your cellular regeneration rate, she said slowly, is approximately 4 times the human baseline. Yeah, Peter said. I heal fast. Look, it's a long story involving a radioactive spider and a field trip that went sideways in the best and worst possible way depending on how you look at it. Radioactive spider. Radioactive spider. Crusher looked at him over the tricorder with the expression of a woman who had treated Klingon warriors, android philosophers, and a man who had been briefly turned into a caveman, and was now recalibrating her threshold for implausible medical histories. And this gave you wall adhesion, enhanced reflexes, and, she checked the display again. What is this reading here? There's a neurological signature I've never seen before. It's like a secondary sensory network overlaid on your entire nervous system. Peter went slightly still. Spider sense, he said quietly. It's hard to explain. It's like a warning system. Danger detection. It runs ahead of my conscious mind and tells me when something is wrong before I can process it rationally. A precognitive reflex response. I never called it that, but yeah. Basically. Crusher lowered the tricorder and looked at him directly for the first time since she'd begun the examination, really looked at him, the doctor behind the scientist surfacing. How old are you, Peter? 23. She didn't say what her face said, which was that 23 was very young to have eyes that carried that particular quality of weight. Instead she turned to the display and began logging her findings, and Peter used the moment of relative quiet to look around sickbay properly, cataloging everything with the instinctive information gathering of someone who had learned that knowing your environment was the difference between walking out of a situation and being carried out of it. The technology was extraordinary. Clean, integrated, purposeful. Not the aggressive industrial machinery aesthetic he associated with sci-fi in his own world's imagination, but something almost elegant. Everything seemed designed not just to function but to be operated by beings who trusted their tools implicitly. There was a warmth to it underneath the sterility. These were people who believed in what they were building. He was still cataloging when the doors slid open and Captain Picard entered, followed by the android, Data. And the ship's counselor, Troy, whose dark eyes found Peter's immediately with that particular quality of attention he was already learning to recognize as her empathic focus engaging. Picard folded his hands. How is he, Doctor? I prefer unique, Peter offered. I'll note your preference. She didn't change the word. Picard pulled a chair to face Peter directly, another thing Peter was cataloging, that this captain chose to sit rather than stand when he wanted a real conversation, that he positioned himself at eye level rather than using height as authority. Deliberate. Respectful. Either an instinct or a very refined skill. Peter suspected both. Mr. Parker, Picard began. What I'm about to share with you is not intended to alarm you, but I believe you deserve complete honesty rather than managed information. He paused. The voice you described, the one that called you an arachnid, I believe I know who it belongs to. Peter's spider sense ticked upward slightly. Not danger. Dread. Who? An entity called Q. He is a member of an omnipotent collective called the Q Continuum. He has interfered with this ship and this crew on multiple occasions. His motives are, Picard chose the word carefully, opaque. He presents interference as curiosity, cruelty as education, and chaos as philosophy. He is not malevolent in the way that most threats are malevolent. He is something considerably more complicated and in many ways more troubling. An omnipotent being who thinks messing with people is interesting, Peter said flatly. Great. In my universe we call those guys problems. We call them that here as well, Picard said, with a dryness that suggested significant personal history. Can he send me back? The silence that followed that question was precisely 2 seconds long. Peter counted them. 2 seconds was long enough to contain the answer before anyone spoke it. Yes, Troy said gently. Almost certainly. But he won't, Peter finished. Not yet. Not until whatever he wants to see has happened. He looked at Picard steadily. What does he want to see? With Q, Picard said, that is never immediately clear. But in my experience, his scenarios always contain a genuine test beneath the performance. He is theatrical. He is also, underneath everything, curious about humanity in a way that is almost earnest. He wants to know what we are made of. So he grabbed a guy from another universe to, what? Show you something you couldn't see with just your own people. Data tilted his head. That is a logical interpretation. You represent a variable that exists outside Federation parameters. Your capabilities, your psychology, your ethical framework, none of it was shaped by this galaxy's history or values. You are, in essence, a control group for the human condition. Peter stared at him. You just described me like a science experiment. I described you accurately, Data said, without any apparent awareness that this might land differently than intended. I apologize if the framing was reductive. I assure you the intent was analytical rather than diminishing. Peter looked at the android for a long moment, the gold skin, the amber eyes that processed everything without fatigue, the precise diction carrying something that wasn't quite emotion but wasn't quite its absence either. He thought about what it meant to be a unique thing in a world that didn't have a category for you. He thought he might understand Data better than Data expected. It's fine, Peter said. I've been called worse things than a control group. He flexed his right hand absently, feeling the slight ache in the web shooter mechanism where the transit had jarred the casing. He needed to check the fluid cartridge levels. He'd been mid-pursuit when Q grabbed him, which meant he'd been firing at moderate capacity. 90 minutes of fluid remaining, maybe less. He made a mental note and filed it alongside everything else he was quietly managing beneath the surface of this conversation. Captain, Worf's voice came through the comm badge on Picard's uniform, clipped and precise, you are needed on the bridge. We are receiving a long-range subspace signal. Starfleet Command is requesting a full report on the biosignature anomaly logged at 0347 hours. Picard stood, smoothing his uniform jacket with a gesture that seemed almost habitual, the small physical punctuation of a man recollecting himself before returning to duty. He looked at Peter with an expression that was not unkind. You will remain aboard this ship for now, Mr. Parker. Not as a prisoner, as a guest. However, I would ask that you allow us to understand your situation more fully before any further, sealing incidents. Yeah, Peter said. About that. I want to help. Whatever you need, I'm not good at sitting still when there's something I could be doing. Picard paused at the door. Something crossed his face, recognition, perhaps. The particular recognition of a man who had spent his entire career surrounded by people constitutionally incapable of sitting still when action was possible, and had found it simultaneously maddening and indispensable. I suspected as much, he said. We will find a use for your particular talents, Mr. Parker. For now, rest. Eat something. Beverly will direct you to the replicator. The doors slid shut behind him. Peter sat alone on the bio bed for a moment, listening to the hum of a starship that wasn't his, in a universe that had never heard of Queens, thinking about a web fluid supply that was already counting down. Somewhere out in the dark between stars, though Peter Parker couldn't possibly know it yet, a Borg long-range sensor array had just finished processing an anomalous bioelectric signature logged in Federation space. The collective began to calculate. The laboratory assigned to Data and Geordi LaForge was on Deck 7, tucked between a secondary EPS relay junction and a storage bay that smelled faintly of industrial lubricant, a smell that, Geordi explained cheerfully, came from a plasma conduit repaired 3 weeks ago that the environmental systems hadn't fully scrubbed yet. Peter found the imperfection oddly comforting. Even a starship this advanced had maintenance backlogs. Some things were universal. The lab itself was another matter entirely. Okay, Peter said, standing in the doorway and taking it in. Okay, I'm not going to pretend this isn't the most impressive thing I've ever walked into, because it absolutely is, and I went to MIT. Geordi LaForge looked up from his workstation with the particular brightness of an engineer who had just been handed an unprecedented problem and was genuinely delighted about it. His visor. The distinctive curved device bridging his temples, replacing eyes that had never functioned, caught the laboratory light in a way that made Peter's spider sense register him as neither threat nor unknown but something closer to kindred. Another person who had rebuilt their relationship with the world around a piece of technology fused to their body. "You went to MIT?" Geordi asked. "Full scholarship. Biochem and applied physics. Graduated early." Peter paused. "Then I became a superhero and the academic career got complicated. I have approximately 412 follow-up questions about that sequence of events," Data said from the adjacent station, already cross-referencing Peter's statement against Federation historical databases. "However, Captain Picard indicated we should prioritize the analysis of your biological profile. I have taken the liberty of beginning a preliminary framework based on Dr. Crusher's initial tricorder readings." He turned the display toward Peter, and Peter leaned in, and then leaned in further, because the data on that screen was his own biology. It was the most complete external analysis of his own physiology he had ever seen. "Your adhesion mechanism," Data began, with the focused pleasure of someone doing exactly what they were built for, operates through van der Waals force amplification at the cellular level. Each contact point on your hands and feet generates approximately 10,000 individual microscale adhesive interactions simultaneously. The aggregate produces what Dr. Crusher's readings measured as a surface adhesion force of 470 pounds per square inch at full contact, Peter said automatically. "Yeah. I've run those numbers. The interesting part is the neural override. I don't have to think about releasing. It's instantaneous and total." Geordi stared at him. "You've calculated your own adhesion coefficient." "I got bored one night and I had a really good scale." Peter shrugged. "The wall crawling was easier to quantify than the spider sense. The sense is, it's not electromagnetic. It's not chemical. I've never been able to fully characterize the mechanism. It's the one part of my biology that my own science can't fully explain." Data and Geordi exchanged a look that Peter was learning to recognize as their version of excited. It was subtle, a fractional quickening in Geordi's posture, a 0.3-second pause in Data's blinking cycle, but it was there. "That is precisely the component that interests us most," Data said. "Your neurological scans reveal a secondary sensory network that does not correspond to any known biological structure in Federation xenobiological records. It appears to process information that arrives, and here I must choose my words carefully, slightly ahead of standard linear time." The room went quiet. Even the background hum of the ship seemed to pause respectfully. "What?" Peter said. "The signal processing speed of your spider sense," Data continued, "exceeds the theoretical maximum for biological neural transmission by a factor of approximately 12. The only mechanism that would account for this discrepancy is if the sense is not processing information that has already occurred, but information that is, statistically imminently about to occur. Essentially, your nervous system is solving the immediate future as a probability equation and feeding the solution into your motor cortex before the causal event fully manifests." Peter sat down on a lab stool. Not because he needed to. Because this was the kind of information that deserved to be received sitting down. "I knew it was fast," he said slowly. "I never thought about, I always just called it a warning system." "It is considerably more than a warning system," Data said. "It is, functionally, a biological predictive combat processor. The implications for tactical application are..." "Data." Geordi's voice carried a quiet note of caution. Data stopped. "Recalibrated. Forgive me. I was moving ahead of the immediate analysis." Peter looked between them. The spider sense was murmuring again, not danger, exactly, but the particular frequency it used when something in his environment had shifted in a way that wasn't immediately visible. He'd learned over years to trust that frequency. It meant something had changed that he hadn't registered consciously yet. "You sent a report," he said. Not an accusation. A realization, spoken aloud as it assembled itself. When Dr. Crusher ran her scans, the data automatically went somewhere. Geordi's expression shifted in a way that confirmed it before he spoke. Standard Starfleet medical protocol. Any unidentified biological signature gets logged and transmitted to Starfleet Medical automatically. It's a safety measure. It's not. Where did it go? Starfleet Medical on Earth, primarily. And the automated network would have distributed a summary to all active Starfleet vessels in range as a xenobiological alert. Geordi paused. That's a standard radius of about 30 light-years in every direction. Which means, Peter said carefully, that a detailed biological profile of my spider sense, including whatever data just figured out about it being a predictive system, is now sitting in databases accessible to how many people? Theoretically, Data said, any Starfleet-connected system within subspace communication range. Which, given current relay infrastructure, he calculated, encompasses approximately 60% of Federation space, several Allied Klingon monitoring stations operating under the Khitomer Accords, and, he stopped. The pause was fractional. For Data, it was significant. And what? Peter asked. And 17 deep space relay buoys positioned along the Federation's borders with unclaimed space. Data looked at Geordi. The look was precise and controlled. Underneath it, if you knew how to read him, and Peter was already learning, was something adjacent to concern. Including 4 buoys positioned in proximity to the area of space designated as Transwarp Conduit Emergence Point Delta 7. The name meant nothing to Peter. The way both engineers reacted to it meant everything. "What's Delta 7?" he asked. Geordi took a breath. He pulled up a star chart on the main display, and highlighted a region of space at the far edge of the Federation's borders. A region marked in the chart's notation system with a specific symbol, a symbol that, even without knowing this galaxy's iconography, Peter's pattern recognition filed immediately as a warning marker. "It's a known Borg approach vector," Geordi said. "One of the transwarp corridors they've used before to enter Federation space." The lab was very quiet. Peter looked at the star chart. He looked at the warning marker. He looked at the trajectory lines that Data had already, without being asked, extrapolated from the buoy positions, lines that terminated, with Federation-level navigational precision, at the current coordinates of the USS Enterprise-D. "So," Peter said. "My biological profile. The one that apparently describes a predictive combat processing system that no species in your records has ever had before." He looked at Data. "You think the Borg intercepted that signal?" "I think," Data said, with the particular care of someone choosing accuracy over comfort, "that the probability the Borg intercepted some version of that signal, given the buoy positions and the automated distribution protocol, is approximately," he calculated, 91.7%. "And if they did," Peter said, already knowing the answer, already feeling the spider sense shift from murmur to a low, steady tone that wasn't quite alarm but was leaning toward it, "they're not coming to say hello." "No," Geordi said quietly. "They're not." Somewhere on the bridge above them, Worf's console registered a subspace distortion at the edge of long-range sensor range. Small. Precise. Moving at transwarp velocity toward a fixed point in Federation space. Moving toward them. The bridge alert came in 3 tones, low, lower, then a sustained pulse that Peter felt through the deck plating before he heard it properly, a vibration that climbed through the soles of his boots and registered in his spider sense as something distinct from the ship's normal operational hum. The Enterprise had changed posture. Every system aboard had shifted from cruise to readiness in the span of a breath, and the crew responded with the precise, unhurried efficiency of people who had rehearsed this transition enough times that urgency no longer required panic. Peter was on the bridge in 40 seconds. Nobody had told him to come. The spider sense had. "Mr. Parker." Picard didn't turn from the view screen. I was about to send for you. What is it? Worf answered from the tactical station, his voice carrying the controlled aggression of a Klingon officer exercising professional discipline over instincts that wanted considerably more latitude. Long-range sensors have detected a vessel on an intercept course. Transwarp signature. Travel time to our position at current velocity, approximately 4 hours, 17 minutes. Peter looked at the view screen. The stars were clean and static, nothing visible yet at this range. But something was out there. His spider sense was fully awake now, not screaming, not the sharp directional alarm of immediate threat, but a broad, sustained alert that filled his peripheral awareness like the sound of a distant storm still beyond the horizon. Borg? He asked. A scout cube, Worf confirmed, and the words carried weight that Peter could measure by watching the bridge crew absorb them. Not fear, these people were too trained for fear to show that cleanly. But a specific quality of gravity. The Borg meant something particular to this crew. Something personal. Peter filed that away. They came fast, Geordi said from the engineering station, his fingers moving across his console. If they intercepted the bioelectric report from Medical's distribution, they would have had to already be relatively close to the border to respond this quickly. They were already in the area. Watching, Troy said softly. The single word landed on the bridge with more weight than it should have. Picard turned from the view screen then, and Peter saw something move through the captain's expression. Something controlled and complicated that had history in it, the kind of history that wasn't discussed casually. He knew, in that moment, that whatever the Borg had done to this crew before had not been abstract. It had been intimate and terrible and survived rather than resolved. Red alert, Picard said quietly. The lighting shifted, warm amber replaced by the urgent pulse of red, the ship system cycling upward to full combat readiness. Mr. Worf, alter course. Take us toward the Viridian system at warp 8. I want distance between us and that cube before we decide our next move. Captain. Worf's hand paused over his console. Running is inadvisable. The Borg cube's transwarp capability exceeds our maximum warp. Evasion buys time. It does not. I'm aware of what it doesn't do, Mr. Worf. Do it anyway. Worf did it. His jaw was tight. Peter moved to stand beside Picard at the center of the bridge, and the captain allowed it without comment, which Peter took as permission rather than oversight. They're coming for me, Peter said. Low enough that only Picard heard it clearly. Data's analysis of my spider sense, if they intercepted the medical report and ran their own calculations. They want what you represent, Picard said. Equally quiet. Yes. I reached the same conclusion. He looked at Peter with the steady assessment of a man who never made the mistake of softening a truth that the other person was already prepared to receive. The Borg do not pursue biological anomalies for simple assimilation unless those anomalies represent a significant enhancement to the collective. Your predictive sensory capability. If they could replicate it across the collective, Peter said, and felt the full weight of it as he said it aloud for the first time. Every drone. All of them. Capable of processing threats before they happen. No fleet maneuver in the quadrant would be able to surprise them, Picard said. No ambush. No tactical feint. No resistance strategy that relied on unpredictability would function against a Borg collective that could predict its own future. The view screen showed only stars. Clean and indifferent. 4 hours and 17 minutes of stars between the Enterprise and something that wanted to take Peter Parker apart at the cellular level and distribute what it found across a hive mind spanning thousands of ships. He had been in bad situations before. He had been captured by the Green Goblin, nearly killed by Dr. Octopus, had the suit destroyed, had New York used as leverage against him more times than he could count without getting genuinely depressed about it. But those situations had always been, at their core, personal. The threat was to him. Occasionally to the people around him. Containable, in the grand scheme. This was not containable. This was galactic. The turbolift opened and deposited a figure onto the bridge that Peter's spider sense registered as unknown significant before his eyes processed what he was seeing, a tall Klingon officer, not Worf, in armor that carried the particular quality of authority rather than rank insignia. Behind him, two more Klingon in full battle dress, disruptors holstered but hands near enough to communicate intent without stating it. Captain Picard. The lead Klingon's voice was deep and formal, the Klingon language translated through whatever universal mechanism this ship used with a quality that preserved its original rhythmic authority. I am Commander Korath of the IKS Pagtai-H, operating under the Khitomer Accord's monitoring provision. We detected the Borg transwarp signature at the same time as your sensors, and we intercepted the Starfleet medical distribution that preceded it. His eyes moved to Peter, and stayed there. We want the creature. I'm right here, Peter said. I can hear you. Korath looked at him with the evaluating focus of a warrior assessing an opponent before committing to engagement. It was not a hostile look, exactly. It was measuring. You are the anomaly, Korath said. It wasn't a question. Peter Parker, Peter said. And I'm not a creature. You adhere to surfaces like a targ spider. You move faster than human biology permits. Your nervous system predicts the future. Koratha's chin lifted slightly. In Klingon taxonomy, these are not human traits. The word I would use is not an insult. It means something beyond category. I'll take it, Peter said. Commander. Picard stepped forward, and the quality of his voice shifted into the register he used for negotiations, not aggressive, not yielding, but absolutely immovable. Whatever the Klingon Empire's interest in Mr. Parker, he is a guest aboard this vessel and under Federation protection. He is not a resource to be transferred, studied, or... We do not want to study him, Korath said. His eyes hadn't left Peter. We want to fight alongside him. The bridge went quiet enough that the hum of the warp engines was audible as music. Peter blinked. Come again. A Borg scout cube is 4 hours behind you, Korath said, with the direct simplicity of a man who found elaborate preamble wasteful. The IKS Pagtai-H is a bird of prey with a full complement and a crew that has been waiting for an opportunity to engage the Borg since the Battle of Wolf 359. We intercepted your course change. We matched it. He paused. The Federation runs. The Klingon Empire does not run from the Borg or from anything else. We are offering our weapons and our ship. In exchange. In exchange for what? Picard asked. Korath looked at Peter. In exchange for seeing whether the stories the sensor data tells about this one are true. Whether something that moves like that, senses like that. The Klingon's voice carried something that in a human Peter might have called reverence and in a Klingon he suspected was the closest available equivalent, is worth following into battle against the Borg. The spider sense was steady. Alert but calm. Reading Korath as genuine in a way that was distinct from diplomatic performance. This was a warrior who had decided, on the basis of a medical distribution report and a transwarp signature, that today was a good day to find out what a spider-powered human from another universe was made of. Peter looked at Picard. Picard looked at Peter with the expression of a man asking, without words, what Peter intended to do, not directing, not instructing, but genuinely, respectfully asking. Peter turned back to Korath. I'm not a weapon, Peter said. And I'm not a flag for anyone to march behind. But if the Borg are coming because of me, he felt the weight of that, carried it the way he always carried weight, the way he had learned to carry it at 17 years old over a body in a warehouse, then whatever happens next is partly my responsibility. And I don't walk away from my responsibilities. He held Koratha's gaze. I'll fight alongside you. Not for you. Alongside you. There's a difference. Korath studied him for 3 full seconds. Then something happened in the Klingon commander's expression that Peter hadn't expected. Something that might, in the right translation, be called respect. There is a difference, Koroth agreed. And you knew it without being taught. He nodded once, the precise depth of acknowledgement rather than deference. That is enough for me. Picard looked between them, and if the captain of the Enterprise felt the particular sensation of events accelerating past the point where careful diplomacy could fully manage them, he showed it only in the slight set of his jaw. Then he straightened his uniform and turned back to the view screen. Mr. Worf, he said. Contact the IKS Pagtai-H. Establish a joint tactical channel. A pause. And drop us out of warp. We're done running. The 4 hours passed the way bad hours always passed for Peter Parker, too quickly in the places where he needed time to think, and with agonizing slowness in the places where thinking was the last thing that helped. He spent the first hour in Geordi's lab, working on the web fluid problem with the focused desperation of someone who understood exactly how much his effectiveness in the coming fight depended on solving it. The replicator could produce the base polymer chain of his formula with reasonable accuracy. Geordi had cracked that within 40 minutes, working from Peter's verbal description and a microscopic sample from the remaining cartridge, his visor processing molecular structures at a resolution that made conventional spectrography look like finger painting. The problem was the tensile modifier. The specific compound Peter used to give his webbing its load-bearing capacity didn't exist in Federation chemical databases, and the closest analogs the replicator could produce resulted in a web fluid that Geordi's stress tests, shooting strands across the lab and hanging increasingly heavy equipment cases from them, confirmed would hold approximately 60% of the original formula's maximum load. 60% is still several tons, Geordi offered, with the particular optimism of an engineer who had learned to find value in partial solutions. 60% means I can swing but I can't restrain something Borg heavy without the strand snapping, Peter said. He was already disassembling the left web shooter's cartridge housing with the practiced speed of someone who had performed this operation hundreds of times in worse conditions, rooftops in rainstorms, the back of a moving taxi, once memorably while falling from a building at terminal velocity. I can work with 60%. I just need to know the limit going in. That's actually a very engineering-minded way to think about it. I've been building these since I was 15, Peter said. You get comfortable with limitations when you design your own tools. He looked up at Geordi. Can the replicator produce the cartridge casing itself? My spare count is low and I can't afford to lose hardware. Already running the template, Geordi said. The replicator hummed and produced 6 cartridge casings in Federation-grade polymer, dimensionally accurate to within half a millimeter. Peter examined one, compressed it experimentally between thumb and forefinger, nodded. Good, he said. These are good. He spent the second hour on the holodeck. Worf had suggested it, with the grudging practicality of a security chief who understood that an unknown ally entering combat without any familiarity with the enemy was a liability regardless of their raw capability. The holodeck produced a simulation of a Borg scout cube's interior. Corridors generated from sensor data and Enterprise crew experience, the particular geometry of Borg architecture that defied the clean right angles of Federation design in favor of something organic and industrial simultaneously. Conduits like exposed viscera running along every surface. The green-tinged lighting that made everything feel simultaneously technological and biological. Peter moved through it for 20 minutes, mapping it with his body the way he always mapped environments, not consciously but through motion, his spider sense building a spatial model that his conscious mind could then query. The corridors were wide enough for multiple drones but designed with the Borg's characteristic indifference to individual movement. No cover, no natural choke points, every surface potentially occupied. Except the ceiling. Peter looked up at the holodeck ceiling, rendered as Borg hull plating, dense with conduit runs and structural supports. And his mind immediately began calculating angles. They never look up, he said. Worf, standing at the holodeck control panel, frowned. The Borg collective processes information from every drone simultaneously. They do not have individual blind spots. Right, but they respond to threats as a collective, which means their response time depends on the collective processing the threat and distributing a counter. If I'm on the ceiling moving faster than their response cycle, they will adapt, Worf said. The word carried the particular finality of someone who had learned it as a lesson with a terrible price. The Borg always adapt. Whatever you do once, twice at most, they will counter on the third attempt. So I need at least 3 different approaches, Peter said. He was already moving through the simulated corridor, testing ceiling adhesion on the holodeck surface, confirming that the rendered Borg hull material would give his fingers purchase. It did. Can you program in drone response patterns? Worf looked at him with an expression that recalibrated slightly. Yes. Do it. And don't go easy. What followed was 40 minutes that the holodeck safety protocols flagged twice, both times overridden by Peter before the program could pause. The simulated Borg drones were relentless, adaptive, and completely impervious to damage that would stop organic enemies. Peter discovered in the first 3 minutes that web restraint was temporarily effective, lasting approximately 90 seconds before the drone's internal systems cut through the strand, and that physical impact worked on individual drones but the collective simply rerouted function through adjacent units. He was fast enough that the simulated drones couldn't physically touch him. His spider sense flagged every assimilation attempt a full second before it reached him. 1 second was enough. Barely. He exited the holodeck with a clearer picture and a specific cold weight in his chest that he recognized as realistic assessment. He could survive in that environment. He could cause chaos. He could not, alone, stop a Borg cube through direct combat. No single person could. He spent the 3rd hour talking to Data. This was the part that surprised him, because he hadn't planned it and hadn't expected it to matter the way it did. He'd gone to Data's personal quarters to ask a technical question about Borg assimilation tube reach, something the holodeck simulation hadn't fully rendered, and had stayed for an hour because the conversation that developed was unlike any he could have had with anyone else on the ship. Data was the only person aboard, Peter had realized, who understood what it meant to be a singular thing. Not unique in the way that all people were unique, but categorically singular. The only one of your kind in any room you entered. Carrying capabilities that others found alternately impressive and unsettling. Navigating a world that had no template for what you were. Do you ever pretend to be less than you are? Peter asked. To make people more comfortable around you. Data considered the question with the thoroughness he gave everything. I have observed that my full capabilities, when demonstrated without context, produce discomfort in organic crew members. I have adapted my behavior to introduce my abilities gradually rather than comprehensively. This is not deception, it is pacing. He tilted his head. Is that what you do? Every day, Peter said. Since I was 15. I've never fought at full strength against a human opponent. Never. Even the ones who deserved it. He looked at his hands. There's a version of me that could end most of my fights in under 10 seconds. I've never let that version out. Because of what it would mean, Data said. Because of what it would make me. Data was quiet for a moment. A genuine pause, not a processing delay. I find that I respect that distinction considerably, he said finally. The difference between capacity and choice is, I believe, the most fundamental definition of character. Peter looked at the android in the quiet of his quarters and thought that Q, whatever his actual motives, had perhaps not been entirely wrong. There were things this crew could show a kid from Queens. Things he hadn't known he needed to see. The 4th hour was interrupted after 37 minutes by the red alert. Peter was back on the bridge in 90 seconds. The view screen had changed. The clean field of stars was no longer empty. At the edge of visual range, resolving from a subspace distortion into solid geometry with the deliberate inevitability of a thing that had never needed to hurry, was the Borg Scout Cube. It was smaller than Peter had imagined from the holodeck simulation. Then he recalibrated and understood that it wasn't smaller, it was that the scale of it was still wrong at this distance, still processing incorrectly against the starfield because his mind didn't have a reference frame large enough to correctly contextualize something that size moving through space under its own power. It was enormous. Dark green-gray, pulsing with interior light that showed through the geometric gaps in its latticed hull. It moved without sound, which was worse somehow than if it had announced itself with noise. Silent and inevitable and absolutely certain of its purpose. "They're hailing us," Lieutenant Rose said from the con. Picard straightened. Every millimeter of him. On screen. The Borg communication wasn't visual in the way the Enterprise's communications were visual. It was a transmission that the ship's systems rendered as a voice. Flat, layered, carrying the quality of thousands of individual voices compressed into a single signal, all speaking the same words at the same moment, and the effect was not loud but was instead the most complete sound Peter had ever heard. A sound with no gaps in it. No space for individual breath or hesitation or doubt. "We are the Borg," it said. "We have detected the biological anomaly designated Parker, Peter. This organism's predictive sensory architecture will be added to our biological and technological distinctiveness. Your crew will be assimilated. Resistance is futile." The bridge was silent. Then Q appeared, cross-legged and grinning, floating 18 inches above the captain's chair, wearing what appeared to be a Starfleet admiral's uniform with the insignia replaced by a small embroidered question mark. "Well," Q said brightly. "Here we all are. Isn't this exciting?" Peter's spider sense hit a register it had never quite reached before, not danger, not dread, but something that in a different context might almost be called certainty. The feeling of standing at the exact fulcrum point where everything that happened next would matter. "Q," Picard said, with the controlled fury of a man who had been saving a specific tone of voice for a specific moment for a very long time. "What have you done? What have I done?" Q pressed a hand to his chest in theatrical affront. "Jean-Luc. I brought you a gift." He looked at Peter with those ancient, capricious eyes that were doing something more complex than amusement behind the performance. The question, and it is, as always, the only question worth asking, is what he will do with what he is. The Borg cube held its position. Waiting. Patient in the way that only something without mortality could be patient. Peter Parker stood on the bridge of the USS Enterprise and felt the weight of a galaxy's future settle into the familiar place between his shoulder blades where responsibility always lived. The tactical meeting convened in the observation lounge with a speed that reflected the shrinking distance between the Enterprise and the Borg cube outside. For 0.2 kilometers and holding, the cube maintaining position with the absolute stillness of something that had decided waiting was a form of pressure and was entirely correct about that. Around the curved table sat Picard, Worf, Data, Troy, Crusher, Geordi, and Commander Riker, who had been on an away mission to a nearby Federation outpost when the alert triggered and had beamed back with the particular energy of a man who had been briefed on the situation in transit and was still integrating the parts about omnipotent beings and spider-powered visitors from alternate universes. He'd taken one look at Peter, extended a hand, and said, "Will Riker, first officer," with the easy confidence of someone who had decided that extraordinary circumstances were simply the standard circumstances of his life, which Peter respected enormously. Commander Koroth stood at the far end of the table, arms crossed, his two officers flanking him with the disciplined stillness of Klingon warriors on formal ground. Q sat on the windowsill with his legs dangling over the stars, apparently unbothered by the fact that he had not been invited. "You're not participating in this briefing," Picard told him. "I'm observing," Q said pleasantly. "There's a difference. You of all people should appreciate distinctions." Picard looked at him for precisely 2 seconds, the duration, Peter was learning, that Picard allocated to things that didn't deserve more, then turned to the table. "Options," Picard said. Worf went first, because Worf always went first when the question on the table was combat-shaped. The Pag-Taich's disruptor banks in conjunction with our phaser arrays and photon torpedoes represent a combined offensive capability that could damage the cube's outer hull. Borg shielding will adapt within, he checked his console, 3 to 4 volleys. After adaptation, conventional weapons are effectively useless. The cube is holding position rather than assimilating immediately, Data observed. This behavior is atypical. Standard Borg engagement protocol does not include negotiation delays. They are waiting. They're waiting for us to hand Peter over, Riker said. Everyone looked at Peter. Peter had been looking at the cube through the observation window for the last 90 seconds, his spider sense mapping it the way it mapped everything, building a probability model from available data, flagging variables, constructing the invisible architecture of what came next. He turned from the window. That's not happening, he said. Simply. Without heat. The way he said things he had already decided so completely that the decision no longer required energy. No one at this table is suggesting it, Picard said, with equal simplicity. I know. I'm saying it anyway so the record is clear. Peter looked around the table. What I want to know is whether anyone has a plan that doesn't involve me being the objective. Because as long as I'm the thing they want, every tactical option you have is reactive. We need to change what they're pursuing. How do you change what the Borg pursue? Riker asked. You make the thing they want inaccessible, Peter said. Or you make themselves the more immediate problem. He pulled a chair out and sat, leaning forward with his elbows on the table in the posture he defaulted to when his brain was running fast. The cube is holding because they think they can take me intact. They want the spider sense functional, not damaged in a firefight. That's leverage. They won't fire on the Enterprise while they think I might be hit. That window closes the moment they calculate that assimilation can repair any damage they inflict, Data said. How long do we have before they make that calculation? Data considered. Given standard Borg tactical processing, and accounting for the variable of your biology being genuinely novel to their databases, approximately 2 hours before they determine that assimilation repair protocols are sufficient to risk aggressive engagement. 2 hours, Picard said. Possibly less, Data said. Possibly more. The uncertainty itself is valuable, it suggests their collective is still processing variables. They have never encountered a bioelectric signature like Mr. Parker's before. Novelty generates genuine uncertainty even in the Borg. Korath leaned forward. Then we strike now. While they are uncertain. A Klingon does not wait for his enemy to finish thinking. Striking now with conventional weapons achieves shield adaptation in 4 volleys, Worf said, and there was a specific texture to the disagreement between these two Klingon, the professional tension of warriors who respected each other's competence and disagreed on its application. After adaptation we have nothing. We'd have one window, Peter said. One good window before they adapt. The question is what we do with it. He looked at Geordi. The cube has a central plexus, a neural processing hub. If that hub is disrupted, it doesn't destroy the cube but it forces the collective to reroute processing. During reroute, individual drones lose collective direction for somewhere between 30 seconds and 2 minutes depending on the extent of disruption. Geordi's eyes widened behind his visor. How do you know about the Borg neural plexus? Worf's holodeck simulation. There was a tactical schematic in the corner of the third corridor render. I read fast. Peter looked at Picard. If your combined weapons fire can breach the outer hull at the plexus location while their shields are still adapting to the first volley you get that window. 30 seconds to 2 minutes where the drones are effectively offline. And what happens in that window? Riker asked. Peter looked at him steadily. Someone goes in. The table went quiet. Peter, Troy began. The spider sense lets me navigate the cube in ways no one else can, Peter said. He was calm. Deliberately, consciously calm, the way he got when the situation was serious enough that anything other than calm was a luxury he couldn't afford. I processed the holodeck simulation. I know the geometry. I know the drone response cycle. And during a neural plexus disruption, the collective's ability to coordinate a response is compromised. My window inside is better in that 30 seconds than it would be in any other scenario. What is your objective inside? Data asked. The plexus itself. If I can physically disrupt the plexus node, not destroy it, just introduce enough structural interference to extend the processing reroute, we buy significantly more time. Enough for your weapons to do real damage while their shields are occupied with internal crisis management rather than external threat response. You would be inside a Borg cube, Worf said. The statement was not a protest. It was the tone of a warrior assessing the weight of a plan. Alone. With limited web fluid. 60% tensile strength, Peter said. I know. I'll be careful with the restraint shots. The Borg will attempt assimilation, Data said. They're assimilation tubules. Take a fraction of a second to deploy and inject, Peter said. My spider sense flags threats approximately 1 second before. I have about a second's advantage on every assimilation attempt. He paused. It's not comfortable. But it's workable. The word comfortable landed in the room with the particular weight of an understatement that everyone recognized and no one addressed directly. Picard had been listening with the focused stillness he used when he was not yet finished processing and knew it. Now he looked at Peter with the full attention of a man who took seriously what he was about to say. I will not order you to do this, Picard said. This ship is not your responsibility. This quadrant is not your home. Whatever brought you here, a glance at Q, who was examining his fingernails with theatrical disinterest, your presence in this situation is not your fault, and I will not allow the implication that the response to it must fall to you. The observation lounge was very quiet. Peter looked at the stars outside the window. The cube was still out there, vast and patient and certain. He thought about what Data had said in his quarters, the difference between capacity and choice as the definition of character. He thought about a man named Ben Parker who had died because Peter Parker had once decided that someone else's problem wasn't his problem. He had never made that decision again. He had never once, in all the years since, regretted refusing to make it again. Captain, Peter said. With the greatest respect. The Borg are out there because of me. The data that brought them here came from my biology. The thing they want is something I carry inside my nervous system. He met Picard's eyes. If I sit on this ship and let other people carry the consequence of my presence, I'm not a guest. I'm a burden. And I've never been comfortable being a burden. A pause. Besides. This is what I do. This is literally what I do. I go into the dangerous place so other people don't have to. Riker looked at Picard. The look was brief and carried something that might have been this is your call but I think he's right. Picard held Peter's gaze for a long moment. Then he stood, and straightened his uniform, and turned to the table with the bearing of a man who had made his decision and would stand behind it completely. Mr. Worf. Work with Commander Korath on a combined weapons firing solution targeting the cube's neural plexus location. I want 4 volleys calculated for maximum shield saturation before adaptation completes. He looked at Geordi. Get Mr. Parker a comm badge and a transporter lock that can penetrate Borg shielding during the disruption window. I want him beamed out the moment the plexus is compromised and he signals retrieval. Then he looked at Peter. You go in, you cause maximum disruption to the plexus node, and you get out. You do not attempt to destroy the cube. You do not engage more drones than necessary. You do not, Picard paused, and something in his expression shifted towards something that was not quite warmth but was adjacent to it, you do not take unnecessary risks. I take extremely necessary risks, Peter said. There's a difference. From the windowsill, Q unfolded his legs and stood, and the theatrical disinterest dropped from his face for just a moment. Just long enough to show something underneath that was harder to read and considerably more genuine than anything he'd displayed since he arrived. Now, Q said softly, to no one in particular, we get to see what he's made of. Peter Parker didn't hear him. He was already moving toward the door, running tactical calculations, checking web shooter tension, and doing the thing he had been doing since he was 17 years old. Getting ready to go in. The transporter room smelled like ozone and focused energy, a sharp clean scent that Peter associated with the moments just before lightning struck, the air's announcement that something fundamentally powerful was about to happen in this specific location. He stood on the transporter pad in his suit, mask down, web shooters checked and rechecked, 6 fresh cartridges loaded at 60% tensile strength, 6 more in the belt compartment Geordi had fabricated from replicator polymer in the last 40 minutes. 12 cartridges. Approximately 70 minutes of web fluid at moderate deployment rate. He had been in worse situations with less. He was telling himself this with the specific internal conviction of someone who wasn't entirely sure it was true. Geordi stood at the transporter console, his visor scanning the readouts with the focused intensity of an engineer who understood exactly how many variables in the next 60 seconds existed outside his ability to control and had decided that absolute mastery of the ones he could control was the only available response to that reality. "Com badge is active," he said. "I've modified the subspace frequency to cut through Borg jamming. It won't be perfect, but it'll be enough for a transporter lock if you're within 40 meters of the hull's interior surface." "Got it," Peter said. "The moment the plexus disruption registers on our sensors, you have a window." Worf's timing on the 4th volley is going to be precise. He's running the firing solution with Commander Koratha's disruptors synchronized to our phaser banks. The combined saturation should breach the hull at the plexus location before their shields fully adapt. Geordi looked up from the console. "Peter. Their shields are going to start readapting approximately 90 seconds after that breach. You need to be at the plexus node and causing damage before that window closes." 90 seconds, Peter said. "I can cover a lot of ground in 90 seconds. Inside a Borg cube, in the dark, with drones in various states of collective disorientation." "Geordi." Peter looked at him. "I've got it." Geordi looked back at him for a moment, and the expression beneath the visor's steady glow was the specific expression of someone who had calculated the odds and found them uncomfortable but had chosen, on the basis of something more than mathematics, to trust the person in front of him anyway. "Yeah," Geordi said. "Okay." He pressed the comm badge on his own uniform. "La Forge to bridge. We're ready down here." Picard's voice came back through the comm, measured and clear. "Stand by, Mr. La Forge. Worf is running final synchronization with the PAGTA-H. 60 seconds. Peter turned to face the transporter beam focus point and took a breath. He did what he always did in the 60 seconds before something terrible and necessary began. He made himself very still, not physically, because his body was always in some state of motion, but internally. He stilled the part of himself that generated fear and redirected its energy into clarity. He thought about what mattered. He thought about the crew of this ship, people he had known for less than a day, who had fed him replicated food and argued about his biology and taught him things in a holodeck and talked to him in the quiet of their quarters about what it meant to be a singular thing in a world without categories for you. He thought about what the Borg spider sense would mean for every fleet in this quadrant. He thought about the things he always thought about in these moments, the specific constellation of responsibility that had guided every significant decision of his adult life. He was ready. Bridge to transporter room. Worf's voice, clipped and precise. First volley firing in 10 seconds. Stand by for shield saturation report. The ship shuddered, faintly, distantly, the way large ships transmit. A vibration that traveled up through the transporter pad into Peter's boots and registered in his spider sense as the signature of significant energy release. Once. Twice. The third volley hit something, because the ship's systems responded to a change in the external energy environment, consoles across the transporter room flickering momentarily as the Borg cube's countermeasures engaged. Shields adapting, Data's voice came through the comm, 40% adaptation. 60%. Recommend 4th volley immediate. The fourth volley was the Klingon disruptors and the Enterprise's phaser banks simultaneously, and even inside the ship Peter felt the difference in scale. The transporter room lights dipped. The hum of the ship's systems surged. And then Worf's voice came through with 3 words that carried the contained satisfaction of a warrior who had aimed at something very specific and hit it. Hull breach confirmed. Plexus location. Disruption registering. Energize, Picard said. Peter felt the transporter take him apart. Reassembly happened in green-tinged darkness that smelled of recycled atmosphere and biological processes, a smell that was both mechanical and organic in a way that made his skin respond before his conscious mind caught up, every fine hair on his arms rising with the instinctive recognition of a nervous system encountering something that was alive in a way that was profoundly wrong. The Borg cube's interior was everything the holodeck simulation had rendered and everything the simulation had failed to render simultaneously. The geometry was correct. The lighting was correct. The scale was correct. The sound was not something the simulation had captured. The cube hummed. Not mechanically, organically. A deep, layered resonance that existed at a frequency just below comfortable hearing. That Peter's spider sense registered not as a sound but as a presence. The collective, even disrupted, even with its neural plexus compromised, was not silent. It was dreaming. Processing. Rerouting through 1,000 alternative pathways the way water reroutes through a damaged vessel, finding every available channel, pressing against every available surface. He had 90 seconds. He went up. The ceiling of the Borg corridor was 15 feet above the deck, dense with conduit runs and structural members that his hands found instantly, fingers pressing into the gaps between components with the practiced surety of someone who had been reading surfaces by touch for years. He moved along the ceiling at a speed that would have looked, to any observer below, like something between running and flight. A horizontal sprint across the overhead surface, covering 40 feet in the first 6 seconds, spider sense mapping the corridor geometry ahead of him and feeding his motor cortex the adjustments needed before his eyes could fully process the information. First drone he encountered was standing in the corridor below, motionless, its collective input severed by the plexus disruption. It was still. Genuinely still, in a way that Borg drones in the holodeck simulation had never been, because the simulation had rendered them as threats and this one, cut off from the hive mind, was simply a biological entity standing in a corridor without direction. Something about that stillness was the most disturbing thing Peter had seen since he arrived in this universe. He passed over it without slowing. 60 seconds remaining. The plexus node was 3 corridors deeper. Data had overlaid the schematic on Peter's visual memory during the briefing with the thoroughness of an android who understood that preparation was the closest thing to certainty that organic beings could achieve. Peter navigated the turns by spider sense as much as memory, the sense feeding him spatial awareness that extended around corners, flagging the positions of 11 drones between his current location and the objective, 5 of them mobile and beginning to respond to his bioelectric signature even through the disruption. The collective was rerouting faster than projected. He moved faster. 40 seconds. The plexus node was a structure unlike anything else in the cube's interior. A convergence point where every major conduit run terminated, where the distributed processing of the hive mind collected itself into something approaching a physical center. It pulsed with the same green-tinged bioluminescence that ran through the cube's hull, but here the light was concentrated, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. Which it was, Peter realized. The closest thing to a heart this entity had. He dropped from the ceiling directly onto the node housing and felt the entire cube respond, a full-body shudder that ran through the structure beneath his feet, through his hands where they pressed against the conduit surface, a vibration that his spider sense translated as sudden, collective attention. Every drone in the cube that retained any processing capacity oriented toward his position simultaneously. He had made himself the most interesting thing in the room. 25 seconds. He fired both web shooters into the primary conduit junctions flanking the plexus node, not to restrain anything, but to introduce his polymer into the connection points, the 60% tensile formula forcing its way into the microgaps of the conduit couplings and hardening there, creating interference in the signal pathway that was, in engineering terms, a very small problem. In a biological neural network operating at this density and this integration, a very small problem in the right place was a cascading event. The cube shuddered again. Harder. Mr. Parker. Picard's voice through the comm badge was clipped with urgency. Our sensors are reading increased drone activity moving toward your position. 30 drones converging. You need to. Working on it, Peter said. He fired 3 more strands into the secondary conduit junctions, targeting the points data had identified as highest signal density, the locations where disrupting flow would force the collective's rerouting process to start over rather than complete. The node housing beneath him was vibrating continuously now, the bioluminescence flickering in a pattern that his spider sense read as distress in a system too large for the concept of distress to have previously applied. The first drone reached the plexus chamber. Peter's spider sense screamed precise, directional, tubule deployment incoming from his left, and he was off the node housing and onto the chamber wall before the assimilation attempt reached the space where he'd been standing. The drone tracked him with the implacable patience of something that had never learned that its target might simply not be there. It raised its assimilation arm again. Peter webbed it to the wall. One strand, precise, catching the arm at the joint where the assimilation tubule housing connected to the forearm mechanism. The drone was held. It would cut through the strand in approximately 90 seconds that he was already moving. La Forge. Peter hit the comm badge hard, moving across the chamber ceiling as 4 more drones entered below him. I need extraction. Now. I have your lock, Geordi's voice came back, tight with focus. Beam out on your mark. Peter looked at the plexus node below him, the webbing he'd introduced into the conduit junctions already visible as white intrusions against the green organic surface, the flickering bioluminescence broadcasting system stressed through every wall of the cube. It wasn't destroyed. It wasn't supposed to be destroyed. But it was compromised in ways that would take the collective significant processing time to identify and resolve. Time was all he'd ever been trying to buy. Mark, Peter said. The transporter took him apart for the second time. Reassembly happened in the transporter room, and the smell of ozone and clean air hit him like surfacing from deep water, and Geordi was already moving from behind the console before the beam fully resolved. Hands checking Peter's suit for any sign of assimilation contact with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been watching the biosigns readout for the last 90 seconds with a level of attention that had significantly elevated his heart rate. You're clean, Geordi said, with a relief so complete it briefly overwhelmed his engineering composure entirely. No assimilation signature. You're completely clean. Told you I had it, Peter said. He sat down on the transporter pad because his legs suggested it was a reasonable idea and because the adrenaline that had been supporting the last 4 minutes was recalibrating towards something more sustainable. His hands were steady. They were always steady during. It was the after that he'd never fully solved. Picard's voice came through the comm, Mr. Parker. Report. Plexus node disrupted, Peter said. Conduit junctions at primary and secondary signal density points webbed with polymer interference. Their rerouting process should be significantly extended. He paused. How much time did we buy? A beat. Then Data's voice, carrying the particular quality of genuine surprise that his emotional subroutines produced when reality exceeded calculated probability. The collective shield regeneration has stalled. Their weapons systems are cycling offline and online in irregular intervals. I estimate the disruption you introduced will require approximately 40 minutes of collective processing to fully resolve. Another pause. That is 14 times my most optimistic projection. Peter leaned his head back against the transporter room wall. Good, he said quietly. That's good. From somewhere in the ship, perhaps the bridge, perhaps simply from the quality of the moment itself, he heard Q's voice, not transmitted through any comm system but simply present, the way Q's voice was always simply present when he chose it to be. "Remarkable," Q said. And for once, there was nothing theatrical in it at all. The 40 minutes data had projected became 31. Peter was still in the transporter room when the alert came through. Worf's voice cutting across the ship-wide comm with the clipped urgency of a security chief reporting a situation that had accelerated past the timeline they'd planned around. The Borg collective had not taken 40 minutes to resolve the polymer interference in its neural plexus conduits. It had taken 31, which meant the collective had adapted to the web fluid's chemical signature faster than Data's models had accounted for, which meant that somewhere in the hive mind's vast distributed processing architecture, a solution to Peter Parker's specific biology had been found, catalogued, and distributed to every relevant system aboard that cube in under half an hour. Peter was on his feet before Worf finished the alert. He hit the bridge at a run and read the situation in 3 seconds from the view screen alone. The Borg cube was no longer holding position. It was moving. Not charging, not the aggressive acceleration of a vessel committed to immediate engagement, but the slow, deliberate advance of something that had finished calculating and was now executing. The green-tinged bioluminescence along its hull had stabilized, the irregular flickering replaced by the steady pulse of fully operational systems. "Their shields are back," Riker said from the command area, standing rather than sitting, which Peter had learned was Riker's combat posture, the first officer on his feet and ready. "Weapons are fully online. They've resolved the disruption. 9 minutes ahead of projection," Data said from the science station. "They have clearly isolated and synthesized a counter to the polymer compound. I am now reading." He paused, with the fractional quality that indicated his processing was encountering something unexpected. "I am reading a modification to their assimilation protocol. They have updated their targeting parameters." Another pause. "They are now specifically filtering for Mr. Parker's bioelectric signature. They appear to be attempting to isolate him from the crew's combined biosignature field." "They're trying to find me," Peter said. "They are trying to lock onto you," Data corrected. "For a direct targeted transporter beam. Borg transporter technology is considerably more precise than ours. If they achieve a lock on your specific signature, they beam me straight to the cube without going through the fight," Peter said flatly. "Yes." The spider sense was running at a register he didn't have a name for, not the sharp directional alarm of immediate physical threat, not the broad sustained awareness of environmental danger, but something deeper and more systemic. The feeling of being hunted by something that had just finished learning how to hunt him specifically. It was, he thought, the worst version of that sensation, because the spider sense had always been his edge, his margin, his guarantee that he would see what was coming in time to respond. Now something out there was working on removing that margin entirely, not by countering the sense itself but by making the sense irrelevant, by removing him from the equation before the sense could protect him. "Can you block their transporter lock?" Peter asked Geordi. Geordi was already working. "I can modify your comm badge to generate a bioelectric interference pattern. It'll scramble your signature enough to prevent a clean lock. But it has a cost." He looked up. "The same interference that blocks their transporter will block ours. While the scrambler is active, we can't beam you out either." Peter absorbed that. "So I'm either available for extraction or hidden from their transporter." "Not both." "Not both," Geordi confirmed. "Turn it on," Peter said. Geordi looked at him for a moment, then modified the comm badge without further argument. Peter felt nothing, no physical sensation of the change. But his spider sense registered it as a shift in his local electromagnetic environment, a subtle distortion field that his enhanced nervous system detected the way it detected everything, by its effect on the space around him rather than the thing itself. "Done," Geordi said. "You're masked. And stuck on this ship unless you turn it off." "And stuck on this ship unless I turn it off," Geordi agreed. Picard had listened to this exchange from the center of the bridge without interrupting it, reading its conclusion before it was stated. Now he turned to the view screen and the advancing cube with the focused composure of a man who had learned through decades of impossible situations that composure was not the absence of urgency but its most productive expression. "Mr. Worf," Picard said. "Combined weapons, full spread. Target their propulsion systems. I want that cube slowed." He opened the ship-wide comm, "All hands, battle stations. This is not a drill." He looked at Commander Korath, who had remained on the bridge through the tactical meeting and subsequent events with the patient intensity of a Klingon who had decided this was exactly where he was supposed to be. "Commander. Your disruptors." "Already targeting," Korath said, with the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for this instruction. He moved to the secondary tactical station Worf had configured for Klingon systems integration, and his hands moved across the controls. With the practiced authority of a combat officer who had been fighting longer than the Enterprise had been commissioned. "The Pagta'h will not disappoint you, Captain." The battle that followed was not the kind of battle Peter was experienced with. In his own universe, combat was intimate, close range, physical, personal in a way that left no distance between himself and the consequences of every choice. He could feel the impact of every blow he landed and every blow that landed on him. He could see the faces of the people he was fighting. He could make individual choices in real time that changed outcomes moment to moment. Space combat from the inside of a starship was entirely different. It was a battle experienced as information, console readouts, comm reports, viewscreen imagery that translated the massive reality of what was happening outside into a visual field his human-scale perception could process. He could see the phaser beams lance out from the Enterprise's hull and trace across the cube's surface. He could see the Klingon disruptors hit in coordinated salvos that Korath's gunnery officer timed with military precision. He could see the cube's response. Not chaos, not the reactive scramble of an enemy caught off guard, but the methodical, adaptive counter-response of an intelligence that processed every incoming attack, cataloged it, and began generating solutions simultaneously with absorbing damage. The Borg shields adapted after the fifth volley. "Recalibrating phaser frequency," Worf said, already implementing the counter before Picard asked for it. The next volley hit with renewed effect, the new frequency bypassing the adapted shield matrix. Effective. Estimated window before readaptation, 30 seconds. "They're learning faster," Riker said. "They always learn faster," Picard said. There was no despair in it. Just the flat acknowledgement of a fact that had to be carried rather than solved. Peter had been watching the tactical display with the focused attention of someone translating an unfamiliar language in real time, and the translation his mind was producing was not comfortable. The pattern was clear: every weapon the Enterprise and the Pagta'h brought to bear achieved a window of effectiveness that was shorter than the previous window. The Borg were not being defeated. They were being educated. "How long before they've adapted to everything we have?" Peter asked. Data did not pause before answering, which meant the calculation was not complex. "At current adaptation rate, our combined weapons will be completely ineffective in approximately 16 minutes. "And then they board," Riker said. "And then they board," Data confirmed. The cube fired for the first time. Not a weapon Peter recognized from any Earth-equivalent frame of reference. A concentrated energy discharge that the Enterprise's shields absorbed at a cost that registered on every console on the bridge simultaneously, the ship shuddering with genuine force, the inertial dampeners compensating but not perfectly, several crew members gripping stations for balance. "Shields at 72%, Worf reported. "Their weapon frequencies are also adaptive," Data said. "Each discharge will penetrate our shields more effectively than the last." Peter looked at the view screen. He looked at the cube, vast, patient, methodical, a machine built from biological components that had been optimizing this specific type of situation for longer than human civilization had been practicing agriculture. He looked at the crew around him, these people who had been doing the only thing available to them, fighting with everything they had against something that learned from everything they threw at it. And he understood with complete clarity that conventional engagement was not going to work. The Borg had adapted to his web fluid in 31 minutes. They were adapting to Federation and Klingon weapons in real time. They were adapting to every variable in this situation as it presented itself, which meant that the only thing they couldn't adapt to was a variable they hadn't encountered yet. Peter turned to Q. Q was sitting in the captain's chair, which Picard had not specifically objected to because there were only so many things a person could manage simultaneously during a space battle, examining his fingernails with the theatrical disinterest that Peter had spent the last several hours learning to read as genuine attention in disguise. "You brought me here," Peter said. Q looked up. "I did. You knew this would happen." "I knew something would happen. The specifics are more interesting than I anticipated, which is saying something." Peter crossed the bridge to stand directly in front of Q, and the sheer physicality of it, a young man from Queens in a red and blue suit, standing in the middle of a starship bridge during an active battle with a Borg cube, looking an omnipotent being in the eye without flinching, produced a quality of silence from the surrounding crew that was different from the silence of people watching combat. It was the silence of people watching something they didn't have a category for. "You didn't bring me here to watch them fight," Peter said. "You brought me here because of what I represent. What you said in sickbay, a test. You wanted to see if someone whose whole life has been built around choosing responsibility over power could maintain that choice when the stakes were galactic." He held Q's gaze. "So here's my question. Is this still a test? Or is this just a situation?" Q looked at him for a long moment. The theatrical expression didn't drop. Q's face never fully abandoned the performance, but something in the quality of his attention shifted, becoming more direct. "Everything is a test," Q said. "And nothing is just a situation." He tilted his head. "What are you asking me, little spider?" "I'm asking whether you're going to let these people die to make a point," Peter said. "Because if the answer is yes, if this is one of those omnipotent being scenarios where the lesson only lands when enough people suffer for it, then I need to know that right now, so I can adjust my approach." The bridge was completely silent except for the sound of combat systems cycling and the distant impact of another Borg energy discharge absorbed by failing shields. Q studied Peter Parker with the full, undivided attention of an entity for whom genuine interest was the rarest available experience. And then he said something that no one on the bridge had ever heard Q say with that particular quality of sincerity. "No," Q said quietly. "I'm not going to let them die." "Then help me," Peter said. "Not by fixing it. Help me find the variable they haven't seen yet." Q looked at him. Then he looked at the view screen. Then, very slowly, something shifted in his expression, not amusement, not theater, but the specific quality of an intelligence that had just decided to stop observing and start participating. "Your spider sense," Q said. "You've been using it defensively. Reactively. Flagging threats as they approach." His eyes met Peter's with an intensity that had nothing performative in it. "You've never considered what it could do if it were pointed outward. Toward them." Peter went very still. "The Borg are a collective consciousness," Q continued. "Billions of minds processing simultaneously. A vast, interconnected neural network. And you," Q looked at him with something that was almost wonder, "you have a biological system that interfaces directly with probability. That reads the immediate future as data." He paused. "What happens if you point that system at a collective mind instead of an individual threat?" The spider sense, as if responding to the question itself, shifted. It had never done that before. Never changed register in response to a conceptual prompt. But something in Q's words had connected with something in Peter's nervous system at a level below conscious thought, and the sense was doing something new, reaching outward rather than inward, casting rather than receiving, and the data coming back was. Peter closed his eyes. The data coming back was extraordinary. What the spider sense found when Peter pointed it outward was not what he expected. He had expected the Borg collective to feel like a wall, vast, uniform, impenetrable, the hive mind presenting as a single surface with no distinguishable features because a distributed intelligence of that scale would have no individual seams, no personal variations, no gaps between minds that a probability reading sense could navigate. He had expected the collective to be, in the most complete sense possible, unreadable. What he found instead was a conversation. Not in any language. Not in anything that translated into words or images or discrete units of meaning. But the collective was, moving. Processing. The billions of individual minds that comprised the Borg weren't silent or uniform when felt from the inside of a probability sense reaching outward. They were a constant, churning negotiation of information. Data entering from 10,000 sensory sources simultaneously, being processed, distributed, acted upon, the results fed back into the network as new data that generated new processing that produced new action in a cycle so fast and so vast that from the outside it looked like a single, unified will. But it wasn't a single will. It was consensus, achieved at a speed that made the distinction invisible from the outside. And consensus, Peter understood with the sudden clarity of a mind connecting two things it had always known separately, had a direction. A momentum. A next step that the entire collective was already moving toward before any individual drone had physically begun the action. The spider sense wasn't reading the Borg the way it read an individual attacker, one body, one intent, one trajectory of threat. It was reading the collective the way it read a crowd, the way it had always been able to track multiple simultaneous threats in a complex environment, extrapolating the interaction of many moving parts into a single coherent picture of what was about to happen next. And right now, what was about to happen next was very specific. Peter opened his eyes. "They're going to fire an assimilation beam in 11 seconds, he said. "Targeting the engineering hull. They've calculated that disabling warp drive prevents our escape and forces a boarding scenario on their terms." Every head on the bridge turned toward him. "Mr. Worf," Peter said, and the words came out with a certainty that wasn't performance, "rotate shield frequency to pattern delta on the engineering hull. Now." Worf looked at Picard. The look lasted less than 1 second. "Do it," Picard said. Worf's hands moved. The shield rotation completed in 4 seconds. 7 seconds later, the Borg assimilation beam struck the engineering hull at the precise angle and frequency Peter had described, and deflected. Not perfectly, not without cost, the shields dropping another 6% from the impact, but deflected from its intended penetration point, the beam scattering across the hull surface without achieving the targeted system access the collective had calculated for. The bridge was silent for a beat that lasted much longer than its actual duration. "How?" Riker said. Not a question with a rising inflection. A statement of disbelief that had arrived at the wrong grammatical form. "The spider sense," Peter said. He was already processing the next wave of collective movement, feeling the vast distributed mind outside recalculating, generating new consensus, new direction, new intended action. It reads probability. Individual threats, environmental hazards, that's how I've always used it. But the Borg collective it's a neural network. Every action they take is the output of a consensus process that runs slightly ahead of the physical action itself. The sense can read that consensus forming." He paused. "I can feel what they're going to do before they do it." The silence that followed was different from the previous one. This was the silence of a room full of highly trained professionals rapidly restructuring their understanding of what was possible in the next 16 minutes. Data spoke first, because data's processing didn't require the restructuring pause that organic minds needed. If Mr. Parker can provide predictive tactical data on Borg actions before they manifest. Shield rotation targets, weapons frequency shifts, boarding party deployment vectors. He calculated, our defensive effectiveness increases by a factor of approximately 8.3. Our offensive effectiveness, if we can preposition weapon impacts at locations the Borg shields have not yet rotated to protect, increases by a factor of, another calculation, considerably more. They're going to shift their weapons frequency in approximately 8 seconds, Peter said. Compensate now and your next volley hits before their new shield configuration is fully established. Worf was already moving. Recalibrating. The volley hit. The cube shuddered visibly, on the view screen, the geometric hull sections absorbing an impact at a point the collective hadn't fully protected. Debris, if the word applied to Borg hull material, scattered from the impact site, and the cube's bioluminescent pulse flickered momentarily before stabilizing. Effective, Data said. Direct hit on secondary weapons array. Their forward firing capacity is reduced by 31%. Karatha's voice came through the tactical comm from the Pag-Taich, and it carried something Peter hadn't heard in the Klingon commander's voice before, not excitement exactly, because Klingon warriors moved through battle in a state that made excitement seem insufficient, but a quality of engagement that was deeper and more complete than what had been there before. The spider creature reads their moves, Karath said. He calls the direction and we fire into it. This is a good way to fight. Agreed, Worf said, and the agreement between these two Klingon in this moment was its own small remarkable event. For the next 11 minutes, Peter Parker stood at the center of the bridge of the USS Enterprise-D and did something he had never done before. He did not fight. He did not swing or punch or restrain or dodge or make the quick improvised physical choices that had defined every significant battle of his life. He stood still. Essentially still, his eyes open but focused inward, his full conscious attention directed at the sensation of the Borg collective's probability flow moving through his spider sense like a river through a reading instrument, and he talked. He described what was coming. Worf and Karath responded. The Enterprise and the Pag-Taich moved accordingly, and every time the Borg manifested the action Peter had predicted, it met a counter that was already in position. It was not a rout. The Borg were not being destroyed. They were an entity of such vast capability and such fundamental resilience that even fighting an enemy who knew their next move before they made it, they remained dangerous, adaptive, and present. The cube's shields continued to adapt. Its weapons continued to evolve. Individual predictions gave the Enterprise an edge but did not give it immunity. 3 more energy discharges struck home during the 11 minutes, the shields dropping to 41%, Worf reporting structural stress on the secondary hull, with the controlled urgency of a man managing multiple simultaneous crises and keeping all of them in view. But the Borg were not winning. And the Borg, Peter realized at minute 8, knew it. The collective's probability flow shifted. Not in its tactical output the weapon's fire continued, the shield adaptations continued but in something deeper. An undercurrent that the spider sense read as a change in the consensus process itself. The hive mind was no longer purely focused on the tactical situation outside the cube. It was focused on Peter. On the anomaly. On the specific biological mechanism that was reading its intentions and negating them. The collective was adapting its thinking rather than its technology. Something's changing, Peter said. The certainty in his voice shifted slightly, still present, but carrying the particular quality of certainty encountering its own limit. They're not adapting their weapons or their shields. They're changing how they form consensus. If they can randomize the timing of their collective decision-making, introduce deliberate noise into the consensus process, they would reduce the predictability of their own actions, Data said immediately. Essentially, they would introduce controlled chaos into their own collective mind to counter your ability to read its output. Yeah. Peter felt the shift continuing, the probability flow becoming turbulent where it had been directional, the clear signal he'd been reading developing interference patterns that made it harder to resolve into specific, actionable predictions. I'm losing resolution. It's still there, but it's getting harder to read. Like static on a frequency. How long before you lose it entirely? Picard asked. I don't know. Minutes. Maybe less. Peter opened his eyes fully and looked at Picard. They're sacrificing their own tactical efficiency to blind me. They're willing to fight less effectively right now if it means taking away my ability to read them. Because they still want you, Riker said. Even damaged. Even fighting at reduced effectiveness. They've calculated that neutralizing my predictive advantage is worth the short-term cost, Data said. In the long term, if they can assimilate. They won't, Peter said. The flat certainty of it stopped Data mid-sentence. Peter looked at the view screen. The cube was still there. Vast, patient, and now doing something unprecedented in Borg tactical history, deliberately corrupting its own collective coherence to counter a single biological organism's sensory capability. He thought about what that meant. He thought about what it said about the spider sense that the most adaptive intelligence in the quadrant had decided the most efficient path to victory was to make itself less efficient. He thought about what Q had said. What you could do if you pointed the sense outward instead of inward. He hadn't pointed it outward yet. Not fully. He had read the collective surface, the tactical output, the decision flow, the immediate intentions manifesting at the leading edge of the hive mind's attention. But the collective was vast. It extended deep. And if the spider sense could interface with a probability field rather than just detect individual threats. Data, Peter said. The neural plexus I disrupted earlier. Is it fully repaired? Approximately 87% restored, Data said. The remaining 13%, where is it in the plexus structure? Data pulled up the schematic. The primary signal junction in the plexus core. The polymer interference you introduced caused a microfracture in the biological conduit casing at the junction. Borg regenerative systems have repaired the surrounding tissue, but the junction itself is still operating at reduced capacity. So there's still a gap, Peter said. A place where the collective's processing is slightly thinner. Slightly less dense. Technically accurate, Data said. He paused. Mr. Parker. What are you considering? Peter looked at Q. Q had not spoken since the battle escalated. He had been unusually, remarkably watching without performance. No theatrical commentary. No floating above chairs. He was standing at the rear of the bridge with his arms at his sides and his ancient eyes tracking Peter with an attention that was as close to genuine as Peter suspected Q ever got. The gap in the plexus, Peter said to Q. If I were at that location inside the cube, if the spider sense were in direct proximity to the most compromised point in their collective processing architecture, could I push through it? Not read the surface. Go deeper. Into the consensus process itself. Q looked at him for a long moment. You would be introducing your probability reading sense directly into the core of a hive mind that is actively trying to capture you, Q said. The risk of... I know the risk, Peter said. Could it work? Another long moment. Q's expression was entirely unreadable in a way that was different from his usual theatrical opacity. This was genuine uncertainty, an omnipotent being encountering a question at the edge of its own certainty. I genuinely don't know, Q said. And I find that, a pause, remarkable. Peter turned to Geordi. Turn off the bioelectric scrambler. Geordi stared at him. Peter, if I turn off the scrambler, they can lock onto your signature and beam you directly. I know, Peter said. Turn it off. That would give them exactly what they... Geordi. Peter met his eyes. Trust me. The lab was quiet. The bridge was quiet. Outside, the Borg cube held its position, its corrupted consensus process generating turbulent probability flow that was still, even through the static, reaching Peter's sense with the unmistakable signature of a collective mind that was preparing, had been preparing, through all 11 minutes of this engagement for the specific moment when it come for. Geordi reached for the comm badge modifier. He turned it off. Peter felt the Borg transporter lock find him in under 2 seconds, a sensation his spider sense registered as being seen, completely and precisely, by something immeasurably vast, and in the fraction of a moment before the transport beam engaged, he reached back. Not physically. Not with any mechanism anyone on that bridge could see or measure or categorize in any database in the Federation. With the spider sense, at full extension, pointed directly at the compromised plexus junction of a Borg scout cube's neural processing core. He felt the collective the way he had never felt anything before. And then the Borg transported him, and the bridge of the Enterprise-D was empty of Peter Parker, and Picard said one word, one precise, controlled, terrible word, that contained everything. Now. Worf fired every weapon the Enterprise had. Korath fired every weapon the Pagtaich had. The combined volley struck the Borg cube at coordinates Data had pre-calculated as the location of maximum structural vulnerability, the location where the regenerative capacity was most committed to internal plexus repair rather than hull integrity, the location that Peter had identified 11 minutes ago and that they had been waiting, through everything, to use. The cube shuddered. Not the controlled shudder of absorbed impact. The deep, structural shudder of something that had been hit in a place it couldn't immediately repair. Inside the cube, in the plexus chamber, Peter Parker's spider sense met the Borg collective mind at its most compromised point and did something that had no scientific framework in any database in any universe he had ever inhabited. He showed it the future. Not maliciously. Not as a weapon. He showed it the probability flow the same way his sense had always shown him. The immediate, unfolding, branching consequence of every current action. The Borg collective, a mind built from assimilated knowledge and optimized for perfect tactical processing, encountered a biological probability engine running at full capacity in direct contact with its core neural architecture, and the result was something the collective had never computed for. Uncertainty. Genuine, unresolvable, cascading uncertainty. The sense feeding the collective not a single future but every future simultaneously, the full branching probability tree of every action and consequence available from this moment forward, an information load that even a hive mind of billions could not process into actionable consensus without time that the Enterprise's weapons barrage was not providing. The cube stopped. Not powered down. Not destroyed. Stopped. Every system holding at current state, every drone frozen in position, the collective's processing entirely consumed by the probability cascade Peter's sense was feeding directly into its neural core, unable to generate new consensus while simultaneously attempting to resolve an information input it had no framework to categorize. It lasted 19 seconds. 19 seconds was enough. "Geordi," Picard said, very quietly. "Get him out." The modified transporter beam. Recalibrated during the battle to punch through Borg shielding at the specific frequency Data had identified, reached into the cube and found Peter Parker's bioelectric signature in the plexus chamber and brought him home. He materialized on the transporter pad in a way that was different from the previous transports. Less controlled, his legs not quite responding immediately, his body's orientation slightly wrong as the beam resolved, and he would have gone down onto the pad entirely if Geordi hadn't been there, already moving, catching him by the arm with both hands and holding him up through the first 3 seconds of reassembly with the focused physical presence of someone who had decided that maintaining contact was the most important thing he could do right now. Peter's eyes were open. He was conscious. His hands were moving, slowly, slightly, the fingers flexing in a way that looked automatic rather than intentional, like a system running a diagnostic. "I'm okay," he said. His voice was steady. The rest of him was taking a moment to catch up with the statement. "What happened in there?" Geordi asked. Peter looked at his hands. At the web shooters. At the transporter room ceiling and the ozone-sharp air and the distant sound of the Enterprise's weapons cycling down to standby. He thought about what it had felt like to push the spider sense into the core of a collective mind and show it the full, unresolvable branching tree of consequence. He thought about the collective's response, not aggression, not pain exactly, but a quality of overwhelm that even a hive mind of billions could not contain or process or escape. "I gave them too much information," Peter said. "They're built to process everything. I showed them everything, every probability, every branch, every possible future from this moment forward. Every consequence of every action simultaneously." He flexed his hands one more time. "Even the Borg can't process infinity." From the bridge, Picard's voice came through the comm, steady, controlled, carrying something underneath the control that was not quite relief but was moving toward it. "The cube is withdrawing," Picard said. "Transwarp conduit forming at bearing 317. They're leaving." The transporter room was very quiet. "They'll be back," Peter said. It wasn't pessimism. It was accuracy. "Yes," Picard's voice agreed. "But not today." 3 days after the Borg cube withdrew into its transwarp conduit and disappeared from Federation sensors entirely, the Enterprise-D held position in the Viridian system while Starfleet Command processed what had happened and decided what to do about it. The processing was, by all accounts, not going smoothly. Peter spent those 3 days doing what he always did in the aftermath of something enormous. He kept moving. Not running, not avoiding, but the specific productive motion of someone who understood that stillness in the wake of high-stakes events was where the weight of those events caught up with you, and catching up was a process best managed while doing something useful rather than while sitting alone with your thoughts and insufficient sleep. He helped Geordi with the shield emitter repairs on Deck 12, because the third Borg energy discharge had stressed the secondary hull's emitter array in ways that the automated repair systems could address but couldn't fully optimize without a second set of hands that understood what optimized looked like from the outside. He turned out to be genuinely useful. His biochemistry and applied physics background translated across the technological gap with more fluency than either of them had expected, and the combination of Geordi's visor-enhanced material analysis and Peter's instinctive spatial reasoning produced repair solutions that were 15% more efficient than the standard protocol. "You're good at this," Geordi said, on the second day, with the simple directness of an engineer acknowledging a peer. "I've been fixing my own equipment since I was 15, Peter said. "You get comfortable with the gap between what you have and what you need." He spent time with Data as well, longer conversations now, less structured than the one before the battle, ranging across topics that neither of them had an obvious reason to discuss but both of them found necessary in the specific way that meaningful conversations are necessary rather than merely interesting. They talked about identity. About the experience of being singular. About what it meant to have capabilities that defined how others perceived you before they perceived anything else about you. Data approached these topics with the careful, precise language of an android who had spent years developing a framework for discussing things his original programming hadn't anticipated needing to discuss. Peter approached them with the shorthand of someone who had spent years not discussing them at all and was finding, somewhat to his own surprise, that the backlog was larger than he'd realized. "Do you think about going back?" Data asked, on the second evening, with the directness that was one of his most disarming qualities. "Every day," Peter said. "Every hour." He looked at the stars outside Data's quarters window. "There are people there who don't know where I am. People who are," he stopped. "It's not abstract. Going back isn't a preference. It's a debt." "A debt," Data repeated, considering the word. "To the people who'd be worried. Who'd be looking." Peter's jaw tightened slightly. "I don't get to leave people carrying that." Data was quiet for a moment. "You experience responsibility as a form of relationship," he said finally. "Not as an obligation imposed from outside, but as the natural expression of caring about the people who exist in your life." Peter looked at him. "Yeah," he said. Yeah. Exactly. I find that," Data said carefully, "to be one of the most human things I have ever encountered. In the truest sense of the word human. Not as a species designation but as a quality." Peter didn't have an answer for that. He looked at the stars instead and felt the particular ache of someone who was a very long way from home in a universe that had been, despite everything, genuinely good to him. The Starfleet Command briefing happened on the third morning. Admiral Nechayev appeared on the view screen in the observation lounge with the crisp, focused authority of a senior Starfleet officer who had spent 2 days reviewing battle reports and sensor data and emerging from that review with a clarity of purpose that expressed itself as efficiency rather than warmth. She acknowledged Picard, received his report on the engagement with the compressed attention of someone who had already read the written version and was looking for what the written version hadn't captured, and then she looked at Peter. "Mr. Parker," she said. Starfleet Command has reviewed the sensor logs of your engagement with the Borg cube. Specifically, the tactical data generated by your predictive sensory capability and its application in combat. She paused. The potential defensive applications of the biological mechanism you demonstrated are significant. Peter had known this moment was coming. He had been knowing it, in the specific way that his spider sense anticipated things before they fully materialized, since the moment data had first quantified what the sense was doing when pointed at the collective. He sat at the table with his hands folded in front of him and his face carrying the particular quality of calm that was not indifference but was its most mature relative. What Starfleet wants, Peter said, is the data. Nechayev's expression confirmed it without softening it. The biological profile of your predictive sensory network, combined with the sensor data from the battle, gives our xenobiologists a foundation for understanding the mechanism. If we can model it, even partially. The defensive applications for. No, Peter said. The observation lounge was quiet. Nechayev looked at him. Mr. Parker. Admiral. Peter's voice was even. Respectful. Entirely immovable. What you're describing is taking the biological profile of my nervous system and using it to develop a weapon, or a weapon-adjacent capability. Something that reads the intentions of any intelligence and turns that reading into a tactical advantage. He paused. I understand why that's appealing. I understand the logic. The Borg are out there, and they're going to come back, and anything that gives the Federation an edge against them is, I understand that it matters. Then you understand why. What I can't do, Peter said, is be the source of a capability that gets pointed at things other than the Borg. He looked at Nechayev steadily. The Federation isn't only fighting the Borg. You have conflicts with Romulans, with Cardassians, with internal political disputes, with a dozen situations I don't know about and probably shouldn't. If you develop a predictive intention reading system from my biology, even a partial model, it doesn't stay pointed only at the threats you currently consider existential. It becomes a tool. Tools get used for whatever the person holding them needs them for. The silence was longer this time. Picard was looking at the table surface with an expression that Peter had learned to read as the captain processing something he had already partially thought and was now hearing articulated more completely than his own internal version. You're describing, Riker said slowly, the problem with every weapon ever developed. Yeah, Peter said. I am. He looked at Nechayev. I'm not saying the Federation is going to misuse it. I'm saying I can't control what happens to it after I'm gone. And whatever Q's plans are for getting me home, I'm not staying here. My responsibility is somewhere else. He paused. So the answer is no. The data doesn't leave this ship. Nechayev looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Picard. Captain. Your recommendation. Picard raised his eyes from the table surface and met the Admiral's gaze with the steady, considered clarity of a man who had thought about this specific question, in one form or another, for his entire career. Mr. Parker's position is consistent with the principles the Federation was founded on, Picard said. We do not compromise individual biological rights for strategic advantage. We do not develop weapons from unwilling donors. A pause. And frankly, Admiral, he's right about the tool problem. Nechayev held his gaze for 3 seconds. Delete the detailed biological analysis from all Starfleet medical distribution records, she said finally. Retain only the engagement tactical log as a classified record at level 10 clearance. She looked at Peter one more time, and her expression carried something that wasn't quite approval but was its professional equivalent. You're either very principled or very naive, Mr. Parker. Probably both, Peter said. In my experience they're not mutually exclusive. The briefing ended. Peter was standing at the observation window in the lounge when Picard came to stand beside him, and they looked at the stars together for a moment before either of them spoke. The stars here were slightly different from the stars of his own universe, the same physics, the same ancient light, but from a different angle, a different position in a different galaxy's arrangement. Beautiful in a way that was entirely its own. Q will come, Picard said. It wasn't a question. He's already here, Peter said. I know. Picard was quiet for a moment. What you did in that cube, introducing the probability cascade directly into the collective's neural core. Data has been attempting to model what occurred since the engagement, and he has described it as, and I quote, beyond the boundaries of any existing theoretical framework in Federation science. It surprised me too, Peter said. I believe it surprised the Borg, Picard said, with the fractional dryness that served as his closest expression of humor in serious moments. Then the dryness passed and something more genuine took its place. You made a significant choice in that lounge just now. Refusing the Admiral's request. Knowing that the data might have helped protect this quadrant against the Borg. I know, Peter said. Does it, Picard paused, choosing the word carefully, trouble you? Peter thought about it honestly, the way he tried to think about the hard questions. Without the reflexive reassurance that made them easier to carry but less true. Yeah, he said. It does. It's always going to trouble me, wondering if the choice I made was the right one or just the comfortable one. He looked at the stars. The only way I know to live with that is to make the choice that I can defend on principle rather than the one that feels urgent in the moment. Urgency is, he paused, urgency is how good intentions become bad outcomes. Picard looked at him with an expression that was quiet and complete and didn't need words. Then he said, simply, you would have made a fine officer, Mr. Parker. I would have been terrible with the uniform, Peter said. I've already got a suit. Indeed you do. Q appeared between them without transition. No flash, no announcement, simply present in the way that omnipotent beings were present when they decided to be, standing at the observation window in what appeared to be a Starfleet captain's uniform that was somehow simultaneously perfectly accurate and slightly wrong in a way that was definitely intentional. Well, Q said. Here we are at the end of our little experiment. He looked at Peter with the full, complex, layered attention that he'd been deploying since the bridge of the Enterprise and that Peter had spent 3 days learning to receive without flinching. You refused the Admiral's request. You know I did. I do. I watched. Q tilted his head. Most beings, given the opportunity to leave something meaningful behind in a universe they're departing, a legacy, a tool, a mark, take it. The vanity of it is irresistible. You refused. Leaving something behind that I can't be responsible for isn't meaningful, Peter said. It's just leaving a mess. Q looked at him for a long, genuine moment. Then he said something that Peter had not, despite everything, fully anticipated. I owe you an apology, Q said. Picard went very still. I brought you here, Q continued, because I wanted to see whether the thing you represent, responsibility chosen freely, consistently, against every available incentive to choose otherwise, was real or merely a story you told about yourself. He paused. I have tested humanity's finest minds and most capable individuals for decades. I have found courage and intelligence and compassion in abundance. I have rarely found principle that held at genuine cost. His ancient eyes rested on Peter with something that was not quite respect, because Q's relationship with respect was too complicated for the word to land cleanly, but was its nearest available equivalent. You held yours. At cost. Repeatedly. Without requiring an audience. Peter looked at him. Is that what this was? A test of principle. Everything is a test of principle, Q said. The only variable is whether the individual knows it. And what did we win? Peter asked. Q smiled. Not the theatrical smile, but something smaller and more real. The Borg will not return to this specific approach for a considerable time, he said. The probability cascade you introduced into their collective has created a processing anomaly they are currently attempting to resolve. The experience of genuine unresolvable uncertainty, of encountering something they cannot predict, categorize, or assimilate into existing framework. Will occupy a significant portion of their collective attention for, Q calculated, with the particular precision of an omnipotent being choosing to be specific, long enough to matter. How long? Riker asked from the doorway, where he had apparently been standing for some portion of this conversation. Long enough, Q said. He looked at Peter one final time. It's time, little spider. Your world has been without you long enough. There is, I believe, a man named Toombs who has been enjoying an unscheduled holiday from your attention. Peter felt something in his chest release. A held tension that had been present since 03:47 hours 3 days ago, the specific compression of someone who has been very far from the place and people they are responsible for and has been carrying that distance as physical weight. He turned to Picard. The captain extended his hand, and Peter took it, and the handshake was the kind that carried more than its physical duration. Thank you, Peter said. For all of it. For not treating me like a variable. You were never a variable, Mr. Parker, Picard said. You were a person. In our experience, that is considerably more interesting. Peter turned to Geordi, who had appeared in the doorway beside Riker, and Geordi gave him a nod that contained the complete, wordless communication of two engineers who had solved a problem together and understood each other through the process of solving it. He turned to Data. The distinction between capacity and choice, Peter said. The most fundamental definition of character, Data replied. I will not forget our conversations. Neither will I, Peter said. And meant it. He turned to Worf last, because Worf had been in the observation lounge doorway the entire time, arms crossed, waiting with Klingon patience for his moment, and when Peter met his eyes the security chief gave him a single, precise nod that in Klingon body language carried the specific weight of one warrior acknowledging another. Peter nodded back. Q raised a hand. The observation lounge filled with light, warm and total, the kind of light that didn't hurt to look at, that somehow carried the quality of a door opening rather than a flash ending, and in the last fraction of a second before the light completed its work, Peter Parker looked out the observation window at the stars of a galaxy that wasn't his and felt, alongside the relief of going home, something he hadn't expected. Gratitude. For a crew who had treated an impossible visitor like a person. For an android who had understood him without needing to be taught how. For a captain who had asked what Peter wanted instead of assuming he knew. For 3 days in a universe that had shown him things about himself that his own universe, familiar and beloved as it was, had never had the angle to reveal. The light completed. The stars outside the observation window were different stars. Peter Parker was somewhere over Queens, falling, and the web shooter fired on instinct before his conscious mind had fully processed the return, and he swung into the familiar grid of a city that smelled of exhaust and food carts and river air and home. Below him, on a rooftop, Adrian Toombs, the vulture, was still standing exactly where Peter had left him, looking at the sky with the expression of a man who had watched something impossible happen and was still processing it. 3 seconds had passed in this universe. 3 seconds and 3 days simultaneously, the math of dimensional transit indifferent to the arithmetic of experience. Peter landed on the rooftop in a 3-point crouch. Where did you, Toombs started. Long story, Peter said. You wouldn't believe me. He webbed Toombs to the rooftop ventilation unit with 4 precise strands, checked the tensile hold, pulled out his phone, and called it in. Then he sat on the rooftop edge and looked at the New York skyline, the familiar, imperfect, beloved skyline of his home, and thought about a captain who shook hands like it meant something, and an android who understood loneliness through the language of precision, and a galaxy full of people fighting impossible odds with whatever they had, which was never enough and was always, somehow, enough. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. It read, "Told you so. Q." Peter looked at it for a long moment. Then he smiled, put his mask on, and swung home. Peter Parker returned to his own universe carrying nothing that hadn't been his when he left, no technology, no intelligence files, no biological data that could be extracted and weaponized. He had refused every opportunity to leave a mark that could be used without his consent, and in doing so had left the only mark that mattered. The memory, held by a crew of extraordinary people in a galaxy far stranger than far, far away, of someone who had been tested at the edge of everything and had not changed what he was. The Borg collective would spend considerable time processing the probability cascade Peter's spider sense had introduced into their neural plexus core. The USS Enterprise-D would return to its mission, carrying classified logs that only 10 people aboard would ever fully understand. Commander Korath would return to the Klingon Empire with a story that his crew would tell for generations about the spider warrior from beyond the stars who fought without a weapon and won. And somewhere in the Q continuum, an omnipotent being filed away the results of his experiment with the particular satisfaction of a scientist who had hypothesized something extraordinary and found, against considerable prior experience with the species, that the data supported it completely. Humanity, Q noted, occasionally produced someone who meant it. Peter Parker was one of them. In the end, that was the whole story. May the Force be with you. More stories await.